Hello, my name is Chris Godfrey. I'm a lecturer in finance at Alliance Manchester Business School. Welcome to my tutorial on using Bloomberg in corporate finance and equity research. I hope you enjoy it.
In this tutorial, we're going to have a look at how Bloomberg might be used for equity research in a corporate finance department, often otherwise called an investment banking division. The example company that I'm going to be investigating today is a Norwegian energy company. I must apologise in advance for my pronunciation of its name. In Norwegian, it seems to be called Equinor, but English speakers tend to refer to it as Equinor. Equinor has the ticker on Bloomberg EQNRNO. So to access it on Bloomberg, I'm going to go to the bar at the top and type in EQNRNO. Then I'm going to press the equity key, or F8 if I'm not using a Bloomberg keyboard. Then I'm going to press enter or go, and that will then bring me to the top screen for Equinor. If I then go to DES or type in DES, I can now get the overall company description. The number of shares in issue is what we would ordinarily use to calculate the market capitalisation. So that the market capitalisation is the number of shares in issue multiplied by the current market price. The free float tells us how many shares are actively liable to be traded. Often in some companies, a large number of shares are held by shareholders who are not likely to readily sell them, such as family shareholdings or government shareholdings. This seems to be the case for Equinor, so that we see that the free float is considerably smaller than the total number of shares. In this column here, we have some valuation multiples. So Bloomberg is telling us that it calculates its price earnings ratio as being 5.03. Its estimated forward price earnings ratio is 5.45. We have an EPS figure here in US dollars of 7.6. And we have a PEG ratio of 1.54. Then down here we have some information on the dividend yield. Now, of course, in a professional environment, we wouldn't take Bloomberg's word for it. We would always go and calculate this ourselves. Over here, we can see some useful information on the company. We can see where it is headquartered in Stavanger. We can see the number of employees at the most recent report date. And we can also see some senior company management here. Moving on to this issue info tab, we get some information about its equities in issue. Down here, we have information on its primary listing. We see that its primary listing is on the Oslo Stock Exchange, where its shares have this ISIN and this CDOL. ISIN and CDOL are two company identifiers that we use to locate individual equities issued by a company. We also have its shares Fiji here, FIGI. Up here we have the most recent public offerings. And then over here we have details of institutional holders and then its top holders down here. In the middle, this panel here tells us which indices, which equity indices it is a member of and the weights that it forms in them. Moving on to the ratios page, we have slightly more detail on some valuation ratios. So we have price to book, that is the ratio of market capitalization to the book value of equity. We have the price per sales ratio, that is the ratio of market capitalization to total turnover or sales, and the price to cash flow ratio here. Again, here we have some EPS data and return on equity and return on assets. Again, in a professional corporate finance environment, we would always double check these by calculating these for ourselves. Moving on to the revenue and EPS tab, we have here a graph of historical sales. And here we have a graph of earnings per share. Note that also this is broken down by quarters as well. Further down here, we have some useful information on its geographical segments, that is where its revenue actually derives from, and their 3-year growth, and also its product segmentation. Finally, we can move on to the environmental, social, and corporate governance tab, where we have Bloomberg's scores for environmental, social, and governance ratings. We have here its MSCI rating and data from Sustainalytics. We also have greenhouse gas emissions down here as well. Next, let's have a look at the process of compiling a company profile. A company profile lists the who, where, how, why, and what of a company. The aim of a company profile is to present the overall nature of a company, what it does, to anyone who looks at it as quickly as possible. So, what sort of Bloomberg resources are there to help an analyst compile a company profile quickly? Well, first of all, we have this description here at the top. So if we click on more, then we get quite an extended version of the Bloomberg description for that company. We may also be interested to see where this company operates. So if we go to revenue and EPS, then we can click on this geographical segments link here, or we can use the mnemonic, which would be FAGEO. So if I type in FA space GEO, and this brings us to a geographical breakdown of, at the top here, its revenue, then its long-term assets, and then its number of employees. So this is giving us a good idea of where it is based. So we can see that in this most recent year, 79.6% of its sales came from Norway and 14.0% came from the United States of America. Going back to the revenue and EPS page, we see that there is a product segmentation page here, which we can reach by either clicking on it, or we can type in the mnemonic, which is FA space PROD. And from this page, we can see the product segments from which it derives its revenue. So we can see that it made 96.4% of its revenue from marketing, midstream, and processing in the most recent accounts. At the foot of this table, Bloomberg also provides us with some very interesting data as to its capacity and production. So we have refining capacity, crude oil throughput, and natural gas production. Let's have a look at the who question. One of the reasons why Bloomberg is so very useful in the early stages of company analysis is that it makes it very easy to find out who the management are and where they've come from. So this is the description page, which I've got to by going to DES. And I can see here that there is an option titled Management with mnemonic MGMT, so that I can get to this page if I type in MGMT as well quickly in the future. So this tells me who the board are and their age and their tenure. And then for more details, I can then click on one of these and then find out more details. So if I click on this president and CEO, then I get his title, his previous employment, even his education. And then if I'm interested in this, I can go to more next to career and compensation. And then go, so this here is his other roles historically. And I can also go to executive compensation, which will also give me his historical salary here. Note that when it comes to executive compensation, Bloomberg isn't giving us any details on share options and those sorts of things. So in order to see what sort of options packages, what sort of incentives packages are being offered, we would probably need to go to the company reports. Another useful thing we can do from the MGMT page is if we click on Show Management History, then we can see who previous directors were. Another very important part of the who element of our company profile is the question of who owns the company that we are investigating. This is particularly important if we are examining a company as a target, that is, as a company which our client may wish to buy. In such cases, it is very important to be able to identify whether the existing shareholders are likely to be willing to sell to a new investor. It's also worth seeing who the new investors are. That is, has there been any noticeable change in the shareholding structure recently? On this description page, if we click through to issue info, then we see that we have some ownership data here with mnemonic OWN. So we can call that up either by clicking on it or by typing in the mnemonic OWN, which gets us through to a very interesting set of ownership data. First of all, let's look at the current tab. This gives us the current, or rather the most recent, shareholders of this company. So here at the top here, we can see that there is one shareholder accounting for 67% of the total shares. And this is the Norwegian Ministry of Trade, Industry and Fisheries. Then we have this second investor here owning 3.38% of the total shares, and they are or describe themselves as a professional investment manager whose main task is to manage the government pension fund Norway on behalf of the Ministry of Finance. We then have some other institutions down here. By clicking on this historical tab here, we can see the change in shareholding. So if we wish to know whether any of the major shareholders have been steadily decreasing their shareholding, this is where we would come. We could also go to the third tab, Matrix, to see what the shareholders in our target company also own in comparable companies. For instance, here we can see that the Vanguard Group has sizable shareholdings not also in Equinor but also in this company here, TTEFP, which is Total Energy. This one here, which BPLN, which is BP, Eni, Repsol and OMV. So if we are having difficulty identifying what the interests, what the activities of a particular shareholder are, then we can see what kind of shareholder they are by seeing if they own similar size stakes in competitor companies. For instance, we have a few investors here who appear not to own sizable stakes in the company's competitors. Furthermore, if we click on these drop-down boxes, we can see which sub-elements of each asset owner own how much. So for instance, if we click on BlackRock, then we can see that there are several BlackRock funds which have their own stakes in Equinor. So here we have BlackRock Inc. Then there is BlackRock Group Limited with these other funds inside it. And we also have BlackRock Advisors LLC. So this helps us to see within the overall heading of one group precisely which funds have ownership stakes in the company which we are looking at. From there, we can go to the fourth tab, Ownership Summary. This tells us more about the overall structure. So what sort of investors are owning this company and also where do they come from? As before, we have government at 74.64%. This is the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Fisheries we found a few seconds ago. We can also see that they have been slightly reducing their stake that between the 30th of October and now there has been an apparent decrease in shareholding of 0.47%. We can also go to insider transactions on this tab here. An insider transaction is a share dealing by an informed investor, that is by usually it is by a director of the company who is thought to possess privileged information. Agency theory tells us that when investors buy shares, it is a good sign because with their access to insider information, they have apparently judged that the shares are underpriced, therefore it is a good time to buy. Also, agency theory tells us that when insiders sell, it is a bad sign because they have apparently judged that the shares are now overpriced, so that it is a good time to sell. And on this insiders chart, Bloomberg helpfully notes the share price graph along with the various times at which those that it identifies as insiders have either bought or sold. Let's take a look at this one here. So this was this individual who sold 120 shares on this date. Going back, this one here, let's click on that. This was another individual that Bloomberg identifies as an insider who bought 2,172 shares on this date. Another interesting menu here is the issuer debt menu. This enables us to see who owns the company's debt. There are various views we can see here. On this one, we have a top-down view which shows the total amount of debt held by each institution from largest to smallest. By clicking on the sideways arrows, we can see the individual bonds that an institution owns. And then by clicking on an individual bond, we can then see who the owners of that particular bond are. In most corporate finance situations, it's not terribly interesting to us who owns the company's debt. We are interested in how much debt the company has, but not in who owns it. However, there may be a couple of situations in which this may become important. The first is a debt capital markets scenario where the company is issuing more debt, and so it may be useful to know who already owns the company's debt because they may be interested in buying some more. The second scenario is where a company is attempting to reorganize its debt. For instance, in the United States, in a Chapter 11 scenario, there may be a situation in which the debt holders have to agree to a reorganization of the company's outstanding debt. Another part of compiling a company profile is to have an understanding of the company's accounts. We can get this by going to the financial analysis page, which on Bloomberg is the FA menu. So in here, on this tab here, we have some key statistics. Important in compiling company valuation, here we have cash, preferred securities, and total debt. This enables us to calculate net debt and thereby enterprise value. We can see also here Bloomberg's figures for revenue, gross profit, EBITDA, net income, and earnings per share. In a professional corporate finance situation, we would always want to verify these figures ourselves. For instance, we would want to verify the cash and debt figures from the most recent available company accounts or company announcements. We would also want to make our own assessment of profit, EBITDA and cash flow from our own calculations using the company's most recent financial accounts. Also in this section, we have profit and loss. We have the balance sheet, cash flow, assorted margins here and ratios, this tab takes us back to the revenue by segments, and then here we have some useful additional information telling us about refinery throughput, capacity utilization and margin per barrel. This section is obviously specific to an energy company and so wouldn't be visible for companies in other industries. Nonetheless, it is interesting to flick through the Reserves tab. For instance, this tab is useful to show us this company's total production of oil and gas through time. On this tab here, we can see the geographical origin of their production, the geographical location of their reserves, and finally a model of cash flows arising from production. If we wish to extract a quick summary of the company, one useful function is to click on this report button here. If I do so, this will now auto-generate a report on this company, which I can now see downloading. If I now go to the download directory for my Bloomberg downloads, which in my case is CBLP, I can now see that Bloomberg has generated this summary report for Equinor, listing earnings and estimates, corporate info, a share price graph, revenue and earnings per share through time, selected ratios, geographic segmentation, holdings, top shareholders, and its primary listing. Previously, I mentioned that Bloomberg has a dashboard of ESG information available by typing ESG. However, for a more detailed breakdown, we can go back to the Financial Analysis menu by typing FA, and then navigating to the ESG tab, which gives us a much more detailed breakdown of ESG statistics. If we wanted to get to this page quickly, we could type FA space ESG. Moving on to the identification of company comparators. One very useful function of Bloomberg is allowing us to quickly identify those companies which are most similar to our target company with respect to industry and size. This is useful both in industry analysis to identify their competitors and also in company valuation, where we wish to identify listed comparator companies which we can use to compile valuation multiples. If we hover over this integrated oils, here we can see that there is a CCB shortcut. If I type in CCB, this takes us to the company classification browser. Now, inside the company classification browser, we can now identify comparator companies by classification, and we can also view statistics in our currency of choice. So let us alter the currency of choice to US dollars. And at the moment we can see that this screen is using the BICS, or Bloomberg Industry Classification Standard. Running down this list, we can see the members of the BICS Integrated Oils list. Then moving down here, we can see that some of these members are quoted, that is, they have stock market listings, and others don't, that is, they are presumably privately held, or may be subsidiaries of other companies. We can then sort on market capitalization or on revenue to identify those which are most similar to our target company in size. For instance, sorting on market capitalization, we can see that Equinor could usefully be compared to, for instance, Exxon, Chevron, Shell, Total, PetroChina, BP, and Petrobras. It might be less appropriate to compare Equinor to some of the smaller companies down here. We can also use other industry classification systems if we wish. For instance, by using this drop-down box here, we can change to using the GICS, or Global Industry Classification Standard. And then again, sorting on market capitalization, we can see from largest to smallest the members of the GICS, Integrated Oil and Gas section. We can also get more detail on comparable companies by going to the Relative Valuation menu. If we type in RV, this brings us to a set of screens in which Bloomberg presents to us what it thinks are the relevant comparable companies. Setting the comparable source to analyst curated, we get this list here, which seem to be members of the EU International Oils Group. And helpfully here, we have a graph of Equinor's price-to-earnings ratio against that of a comparable index here. And then we can change the valuation metric being presented in the graph to EV to EBITDA, or EV to EBIT, or enterprise value to sales. What all these are telling us is that the valuation multiples in this sector have been gradually declining over the past 2 years. If we go and change the comparable source to GICS, then initially we see here that there is only one company listed, and that is because region is set to location of domicile. That is, Bloomberg is telling us that in the GICS classification of integrated oil and gas, in Norway there is only one comparable company. We can, of course, change this. Let's see what happens if we change this to Western Europe. Now Bloomberg is telling us that within the GICS integrated oil and gas sector in the Western Europe region, we now have these comparable companies. Then if we select comp sheets, we then get various valuation metrics: enterprise value to EBITDA, and then forecast enterprise value to EBITDA for 1 year and 2 years hence. We also have current price earnings for forecast earnings for the year ahead and for the following year ahead. Of course, if we were doing this professionally, we would always want to calculate our own assessment of enterprise value using the company accounts. We would also want to calculate our own forecasts or select the precise forecasts we were going to use for EBITDA and earnings. On this EPS preview tab, we have a spread of earnings estimates for each company. Accessing company research. Bloomberg also provides some sources of company research. If we go to DS-RES, short for Document Search Research, and then we go to Asset Class and then select Equity Research, Bloomberg will give us a list of some recent research. What I've done here is to click on the JP Morgan link, and after a while this research report has now emerged in this document viewer window. Of course, also I can change the asset class and select fixed income research instead to get research on its bonds.
So that concludes this tutorial on using Bloomberg in corporate finance and equity research. I hope it's been useful.